We are living in the golden age of mental health awareness, yet we are more anxious, fragmented, and spiritually bankrupt than any generation before us. We try to fix our broken minds with superficial patches, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness apps, digital detoxes, and relentless self-optimization. But Al-Ghazali looked at the human condition 9 centuries ago and realized something that modern American psychology is still terrified to admit. You cannot cure a sick mind by focusing solely on the brain. Your anxiety, your chronic emptiness, and your compulsive need for external validation are not chemical glitches. They are the desperate screams of a starved, suffocated soul. Al-Ghazali was the ultimate elite intellectual, the most powerful academic of the Golden Age, who had everything modern society tells you to chase: fame, wealth, prestige, and absolute intellectual dominance. Yet, at the peak of his success, his psychology completely revolted, paralyzing his body and stripping him of his speech. He discovered that the intellect is a beautiful servant, but a tyrannical master. This isn't a passive history lesson. It is a clinical, existential demolition of your ego. Over the next 4 chapters, we are going to strip away the illusions of rationalism, dismantle the corporate self-help industry, and dissect the architecture of your internal world. By the time the sun comes up, you will no longer look at your own thoughts the same way. We live in a culture that treats the intellect like a god. From the moment we enter the school system, we are taught that our value is determined by our grades, our test scores, our degrees, and our ability to outthink everyone else in the room. We believe that if we can just collect enough information, master enough skills, and climb high enough up the ladder of professional status, we will achieve a state of absolute security. We treat our minds like high-performance computers, assuming that if we keep upgrading the software, we can outrun the natural anxieties, doubts, and emptiness that haunt the human condition. But 9 centuries before the birth of modern American psychology, a man named Al-Ghazali climbed to the absolute summit of intellectual prestige, looked out at the view, and realized that the tower we are all trying to build is completely hollow. Al-Ghazali was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the intellectual world in 11th century Baghdad. He was not just a professor, he was the professor. He held the most prestigious academic chair at the Nizamiya University, which was the Harvard or Oxford of the golden age of Islamic civilization. He was the personal advisor to the Grand Vizier, the confidant of sultans, and the ultimate legal and philosophical authority of his era. When Al-Ghazali spoke, kings listened. When he wrote, the entire civilized world read. He possessed everything that modern society tells you to chase: unlimited wealth, immense political influence, international fame, and an intellect so sharp it could cut through any philosophical argument like a razor blade. Yet, if you open his private journal, a deeply personal memoir called Deliverance from Error, you discover that while the world was bowing to his genius, Al-Ghazali was quietly drowning in a severe psychological horror. He looked at his life and realized a terrifying truth. He was not seeking reality. He was seeking the reputation of seeking reality. His brilliant lectures, his massive books, and his flawless logical debates were not driven by a pure love for truth. They were driven by a desperate, compulsive need to maintain his status. His ego had weaponized his high-level intellect to build a magnificent fortress of superiority. He had become a prisoner of his own prestige, trapped in a golden cage where he had to constantly perform to feed the insatiable monster of his public identity. This is a psychological trap that millions of people fall into today. We work 80 hours a week at jobs. We hate to buy things we don't need to impress people we don't even like. We turn our hobbies into side hustles and our personal lives into social media content, constantly optimizing our personal brands. Like Al-Ghazali, we confuse our social mirror with our true self. We assume that because we look successful on paper, we must be doing fine in reality. But the subconscious mind cannot be fooled by a resume. It knows when you are living a lie, and if you refuse to listen to its quiet warnings, it will eventually stage a violent mutiny. When the subconscious shuts the body down. In the summer of the year 1095, the massive psychological tension inside Al-Ghazali finally reached its breaking point. For months, he had been fighting a losing battle against his own conscience. He knew he needed to walk away from his career, his wealth, and his fame to find a life of genuine integrity. But every time he resolved to leave, his ego would whisper excuses back into his ear. You are the greatest scholar of your generation. If you leave, the university will collapse. You will lose your pension. You will ruin your family name. You are throwing away your life. He was caught in a lethal state of cognitive dissonance, a psychological condition where your deeply held values are completely out of alignment with your actual behavior. His conscious mind kept rationalizing the status quo, creating sophisticated arguments for why he should keep doing what he was doing. So, his subconscious mind decided to bypass his intellect entirely and strike him directly through his physical body. It started on a normal workday. Al-Ghazali walked into the grand lecture hall at the university, stood before hundreds of eager students who had traveled from all over the world to hear him speak, opened his mouth, and absolutely nothing came out. He was completely struck dumb. He tried with all his willpower to pronounce a single word, but his vocal cords were totally paralyzed. The most articulate man in the empire had been rendered completely silent. This was not an infection or an organic throat disease. It was a classic, severe case of functional dysphonia, what modern psychosomatic medicine calls a conversion disorder, when a human being experiences an emotional conflict so intense and painful that the conscious mind refuses to process it. The brain converts that psychological trauma into a physical symptom. Al-Ghazali's body was literally refusing to cooperate with his hypocrisy. His subconscious was saying, if you are going to use your voice to lie to yourself and the world, then you will no longer have a voice at all. But the paralysis didn't stop at his throat. His entire digestive system shut down. He could no longer swallow a single morsel of food, and his stomach refused to process even a glass of water. He began to rapidly waste away. The imperial doctors were called in, and they tried every medicine, every herb, and every physical treatment known to science. Finally, they threw up their hands in defeat. They told the Grand Vizier that this was not a medical illness. It was a sickness of the heart that had spread to the body. They explicitly stated that if Al-Ghazali's mind could not find peace, his body would soon die. This is the ultimate proof that the mind and the body are not two separate entities. They are a single, deeply integrated system. In modern society, we ignore our body's early warning signs all the time. We ignore the chronic migraines, the constant exhaustion, the muscle tension, and the panic attacks, treating them as annoying inconveniences to be fixed with an over-the-counter pill. We tell ourselves we just need to grind through it. But Al-Ghazali's collapse shows us that your biology will always keep the receipts. If you try to force yourself to live a life that violates your deepest sense of truth, your nervous system will eventually pull the emergency brake and shut the entire machine down. The total breakdown of certainty. Realizing that he was facing actual death, Al-Ghazali surrendered. He resigned from his prestigious position, gave away almost all his immense wealth to charity, left his family secure, put on the rough, simple woolen cloak of a wandering mystic, and walked out the gates of Baghdad alone. He completely erased his identity. The most famous intellectual on earth became an anonymous traveler, spending the next 10 years wandering between Damascus, Jerusalem, and Mecca, living in isolated mosque towers and sweeping floors just to survive. He had entered the dark night of the soul. But he didn't just walk away from his career. He walked away from his entire belief system. He realized that if he wanted to heal his mind, he had to tear down everything he thought he knew and rebuild his consciousness from scratch. He began by conducting a ruthless psychological audit on the nature of human knowledge. He asked a deceptively simple question: what can I actually know for sure? What is so undeniably true that it is completely impossible to doubt? He started with his senses. We rely on our eyes, our ears, and our hands to tell us what is real. We look at the world and say, seeing is believing. But Al-Ghazali quickly realized that the senses are notorious liars. He looked up at the stars in the night sky and noted that according to his eyes, a star is no bigger than a gold coin. Yet, astronomical science proved that those stars were actually massive bodies far larger than the Earth. He looked at a stick placed in a bowl of water and watched his eyes tell him the stick was bent, even though his hands knew it was perfectly straight. Our senses constantly misinterpret reality, and it is only our rational mind that steps in to correct the error. Therefore, Al-Ghazali concluded, we cannot base absolute certainty on sensory perception. So, he turned to the next logical step: the rational intellect itself. Surely, the laws of logic, mathematics, and reason are infallible. Things like 2 + 2 = 4, or a thing cannot be both true and false, at the same time must be absolute truths. For a while, Al-Ghazali clung to this rational foundation like a lifeline. But then, a terrifying thought crept into his mind, a thought that predated the famous doubts of Western philosophers by hundreds of years. How do you know that your rational mind is not currently dreaming? Al-Ghazali reasoned that when you are fasting, you experience vivid dreams. You see places, you talk to people, you feel intense fear or joy. And while you are inside that dream, you are absolutely convinced that everything is real. Your mind accepts the reality of the dream without a single doubt. It is only when you open your eyes in the morning that you look back and say, "Oh, that was just an illusion." If that is true, Al-Ghazali asked, what guarantees that your current waking life is not just another layer of a dream? What if there is a higher state of consciousness waiting for us after death, a state where we will wake up and look back at our entire rational, logical, earthly existence and realize it was nothing more than a passing shadow? This realization threw Al-Ghazali into a state of total, paralyzing skepticism. For nearly 2 months, he was physically and mentally incapacitated by this existential void. He had no foundation left to stand on. His senses were unreliable, and his intellect could not prove its own validity. He had completely broken his own mind by trying to think too much. He had arrived at the outer limits of cognitive reason, and he found absolutely nothing there but a terrifying, bottomless abyss. The dangerous tyranny of the smartest weapon. To understand how Al-Ghazali eventually managed to climb out of this abyss, we have to analyze the fundamental flaw of the rational intellect, a flaw that modern American psychology is uniquely prone to overlooking. The human intellect is an evolutionary weapon. It evolved to solve practical problems, to analyze data, to categorize information, to map out cause and effect, and to build tools for our survival. It is an incredibly effective instrument for navigating the external material world. It is the force that builds bridges, cures diseases, and writes code. But the intellect has an inherent, dangerous limitation. It can only work with information that has already happened. It looks at the past, breaks it down into pieces, and tries to predict the future based on those pieces. Because the intellect operates like a machine, it treats the human soul like a machine. When you try to solve an existential crisis using nothing but pure logic, you enter an infinite loop of overthinking. The intellect cannot handle mystery. It cannot handle paradox. It cannot handle the raw, formless experience of meaning, love, or spiritual connection. When the intellect encounters these deep, unquantifiable dimensions of life, it gets scared. It tries to reduce them to cold formulas, chemical reactions, or evolutionary survival mechanisms. It tries to explain them away because it cannot control them. This is the psychological origin of the modern mental health crisis. We have built a world that is incredibly smart, but deeply unwise. We analyze our trauma, we track our biometric data, we optimize our diets, and we read endless articles explaining the neuroscience of our anxiety. We know exactly which neurotransmitters are firing when we feel lonely. We have all the data, all the words, and all the labels. Yet, despite all this intellectual mastery, the underlying emptiness remains completely untouched. Al-Ghazali realized that his paralysis was caused by the fact that he had allowed his intellect to become the absolute dictator of his life. He had treated his mind like the master of his soul, rather than its servant. The intellect is an incredibly sharp knife, but if you don't have a steady hand to hold it, you will eventually use it to cut yourself to pieces. When you over-intellectualize your life, you build a massive mental wall between yourself and the actual experience of living. You don't listen to music anymore. You analyze its structure. You don't just fall in love. You analyze your attachment styles and your compatibility metrics. You don't just exist in the present moment. You watch yourself existing, constantly judging, evaluating, and critiquing your own performance. You become a spectator sitting in the audience of your own life, taking notes, while the stage itself remains completely empty. The illusions of the 5 types of knowledge seekers. During his decade of intense isolation and wandering, Al-Ghazali didn't just look inward. He looked outward at the various intellectual movements of his day. categorizing them into distinct psychological types. He wanted to see if anyone else had successfully solved the riddle of human existence using the tools of the mind. His critique of these groups reads like a direct diagnosis of our modern ideological landscape. First, he looked at the strict dogmatists, the theologians and legalists, who believed that truth was simply a matter of memorizing the correct rules, following the right authorities, and winning theological debates. Al-Ghazali noted that these people were consumed by a profound psychological insecurity. They wore their rigid beliefs like armor, attacking anyone who disagreed with them not out of a love for truth, but out of a desperate need to protect their own fragile certainty. They mistook the memorization of a script for the actual experience of reality. We see this exact psychological profile today in the hyper-partisan political echo chambers of the internet, where people treat complex human issues as rigid dogmas, weaponizing their vocabulary to destroy their ideological enemies, while remaining completely empty inside. Second, he analyzed the pure philosophers, the secular rationalists, who believed that logic, mathematics, and science could answer every single question about the human soul. Al-Ghazali deeply admired their intellectual rigor. He spent years mastering their texts until he could argue their positions better than they could. But he discovered that their pride was their undoing. They were so blinded by the beauty of their mathematical equations that they assumed the entire universe, including the human spirit, had to fit into their neat little boxes. They failed to realize that science can tell you how the world works, but it can never tell you why you should care, or how you should handle the terrifying weight of your own mortality. Third, he examined the esoteric radicals, secretive groups, who claimed that the truth was hidden behind mysterious codes, elite conspiracies, and secret knowledge that only a select few could access. Al-Ghazali recognized this as a classic manifestation of grandiose narcissism. People are drawn to conspiracy theories and esoteric secrets because it makes them feel special. It allows them to look down on the clueless masses and believe that they possess a superior, hidden truth. It is a psychological shortcut to self-worth that requires absolutely zero moral transformation or real effort. Finally, after exhausting all these intellectual avenues and finding them completely bankrupt, Al-Ghazali arrived at the doorstep of the mystics, the Sufis. The Sufis were not interested in debating definitions, memorizing rules, or building grand philosophical systems. They looked at the truth not as an academic subject to be studied, but as a reality to be lived, felt, and tasted. Al-Ghazali realized that the difference between a philosopher and a mystic is like the difference between a doctor who has studied the textbook definition of health and a person who is actually healthy, vibrant, and alive. You can read 1,000 books about the chemistry of honey, but you will never truly know what honey is until you put a drop of it on your tongue. Tearing down the social mirror. The ultimate breakthrough for Al-Ghazali came when he realized that the absolute certainty he had been searching for could never be found through an argument. It could only be found through an experience. His 2-month existential crisis dissolved, not because he found a better logical formula, but because he stopped trying to force his intellect to do a job it was never designed to do. He surrendered his need for control, allowed his heart to open, and experienced what he called a light that God cast into his chest. This light was not a magical vision or a voice from the sky. It was the sudden, quiet return of basic psychological trust. It was the realization that your existence is valid, real, and meaningful, even if you cannot prove it with a logical equation. It was the transition from the anxious chaos of the ego to the absolute stillness of the heart. But to maintain this state of clarity, Al-Ghazali discovered that you have to perform a radical, violent act of psychological demolition. You must completely destroy your dependence on the social mirror. When Al-Ghazali was a famous professor in Baghdad, his entire sense of self-worth was external. It was dependent on the applause of his students, the praise of the vizier, and the fear of his intellectual rivals. He was constantly looking at himself through the eyes of others. This is what modern psychology calls an external locus of control. When your self-esteem is held hostage by the opinions of the world, you are never truly free. You are a puppet being pulled by 1,000 invisible strings, constantly adjusting your behavior, your words, and your thoughts to keep the audience happy. By walking away from everything and living as an anonymous beggar for 10 years, Al-Ghazali systematically broke every single one of those strings. He forced himself to experience the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. He swept floors in mosques where no one knew his name. He stood in lines for bread alongside the poorest outcasts of society. He experienced the ultimate humiliation of his ego, and in doing so he discovered a profound, untouchable freedom. He realized that when you no longer care about looking successful, looking holy, or looking important in the eyes of a broken world, the world loses all its power over your soul. You stop performing. You stop managing your personal brand. You drop the heavy, exhausting mask you've been wearing for decades, and you finally allow your true self to step out into the light. This is the core lesson that Ghazali offers to our hyper-connected, anxious modern culture. We are constantly bathing in the radiation of the social mirror through our phones, our metrics, and our professional competition. We are terrified of being left behind, terrified of looking foolish, and terrified of losing our status. But Ghazali warns us that until you are willing to let your public identity die, your true soul can never be born. You have to be willing to be a nobody in the eyes of society before you can become a somebody in the reality of your own consciousness. Reprogramming the machinery of your soul. The journey of Ghazali's intellectual collapse is not a tragic story of a man losing his mind. It is a triumphant story of a man reclaiming his humanity. He showed us that the limits of cognitive reason are not a prison sentence, but an invitation to step into a deeper, richer way of being. If you want to use this philosophy to reprogram your soul today, you must begin by recognizing the exact state of your own internal world. You must stop treating your chronic anxiety, your constant overthinking, and your deep, underlying emptiness as minor inconveniences to be ignored or managed with superficial self-care routines. You must look at them for what they truly are, a clear sign that your intellect has staged a coup, locked your spirit in the basement, and is running your life into the ground. You have to learn the psychological art of turning off the machine. You must intentionally build spaces into your life where your intellect is not allowed to speak. Step away from the screens. Stop collecting data. Stop analyzing your problems. Stop trying to optimize every single minute of your day for success or productivity. Instead, allow yourself to simply taste reality directly. Walk out into nature and feel the wind on your face without needing to take a photo of it. Listen to music without needing to critique it. Look at the people you love and allow yourself to feel the raw, overwhelming weight of that connection without needing to analyze your relationship dynamics. Move from the constant, exhausting noise of thinking about life to the quiet, profound reality of actually living it. Secondly, you must take a sledgehammer to your own golden cage. You must sit down in a quiet room and honestly examine how much of your daily behavior is driven by a genuine love for what you do versus how much of it is driven by a desperate need to maintain your status, your reputation, and your public mask. You must be willing to let go of the things that are feeding your ego but starving your soul. If your career, your social circle, or your lifestyle requires you to constantly perform, constantly lie to yourself, and constantly suppress your deepest sense of integrity, then you must have the immense courage to walk away, even if the world thinks you are completely insane for doing so. It is infinitely better to be a nameless, penniless, nobody who possesses a deep, untouchable internal peace than to be the most famous, successful, brilliant person in the room while your own heart is physically shutting down from the horror of its own emptiness. Ghazali's legacy is a magnificent, timeless blueprint for psychological liberation. He proved that the mind can build a magnificent palace of logic, but it is the heart that has to live in it. Do not let your intellect become your prison guard. Reclaim your freedom, anchor your consciousness in the purity of the present moment. Step out of the dark basement of your overthinking and allow the light of your true nature to finally reprogram your soul. The four inhabitants of the internal zoo. Most modern self-help systems, behavioral therapies, and productivity frameworks treat the human mind as a single, unified entity. They assume that there is a conscious you sitting in the driver's seat of your brain, and if you make a logical decision to lose weight, stop scrolling on your phone, or quit a toxic habit, you should be able to just execute that plan. But anyone who has ever tried to change their life knows that this is an absolute illusion. You wake up in the morning filled with inspiration, swearing that today you will eat clean and work on your dream project. But by 8 o'clock at night, you find yourself sitting on the couch, mindlessly inhaling a tub of ice cream while binge-watching low-quality videos for 4 hours straight. You didn't want to do that. The logical, conscious part of you explicitly decided against it, yet you did it anyway. It feels as if your body was hijacked by an invisible stranger, leaving you to watch your own self-destruction in a state of absolute helplessness. 9 centuries ago, Ghazali bypassed the superficial layers of behavioral advice and delivered a profound, timeless mapping of this exact psychological civil war. In his masterwork, The Alchemy of Happiness, he explains that you are not a single, unified person. Your mind is a highly volatile, crowded ecosystem, an internal zoo containing 4 completely distinct, competing psychological forces. Every single day, these 4 entities fight for absolute control over the steering wheel of your life. To make his psychological analysis instantly accessible, Ghazali gives these 4 forces vivid, symbolic names: the pig, the dog, the demon, and the sage. The pig represents your lowest, rawest appetites. It is the engine of pure hedonism, biological drive, gluttony, and immediate physical gratification. The pig doesn't care about your long-term career goals, your financial health, or your moral integrity. It only operates on the pleasure principle. It wants food, sex, comfort, and dopamine right now, with absolutely zero regard for the consequences of tomorrow. The dog represents your aggressive energy, your defense mechanisms, and your survival instincts. It is the seat of anger, pride, dominance, territorial protection, and competitive rage. When someone cuts you off in traffic and you feel a sudden hot flash of fury in your chest, that is not your logical mind responding. That is the internal dog barking through your nervous system. The dog wants to bite, to conquer, to be right, and to crush anyone who threatens your fragile ego. The demon is the most sophisticated and dangerous entity in the entire zoo. The demon represents your dark intellect, a brilliant, highly calculated intelligence that has been completely detached from moral truth or spiritual wisdom. The demon does not have its own appetites. Instead, its entire job is to serve as the chief strategist for the pig and the dog. It uses logic, language, and rationalization to design elaborate ways to feed the animal drives, while keeping you completely blind to your own decay. Finally, there is the sage. The sage represents your higher consciousness, your divine spark, your genuine wisdom, and your capacity for objective truth. The sage is the only part of your psyche that understands what is actually good for you in the long run. It is the voice of your deep conscience, the part of you that craves meaning, genuine connection, and spiritual alignment. Ghazali warns that in a healthy human being, the sage is supposed to be the absolute king of the castle, using the intellect to guide and master the energy of the animals. But in the vast majority of human beings, a horrific psychological coup has taken place. The sage has been knocked unconscious, bound with ropes, and thrown into the deepest, darkest basement of the psyche. The pig and the dog are running wild through the house, tearing up the furniture, while the cunning demon sits in the control room, running the entire show. The demon in the control room, how the ego lies to itself. To understand how this internal coup destroys your mental health, we have to analyze the specific, terrifying relationship between the pig, the dog, and the demon. This dynamic perfectly mirrors what modern American clinical psychology calls the process of ego defense and cognitive rationalization. When your lower appetites or your toxic anger take over your behavior, your conscious mind experiences an intense, uncomfortable wave of shame and guilt. If you are a highly intelligent person, you cannot easily accept the fact that you are acting like a primal animal. Your ego cannot look in the mirror and say, "I am a weak, lazy coward who cares more about a cheap hit of dopamine than my own family or my own future." That realization is too painful. It would completely shatter your self-esteem. This is exactly where the demon steps out of the shadows to save your ego. The demon takes the raw, ugly, selfish desires of the pig and the dog, washes them, dresses them up in beautiful clothes, and presents them to your conscious mind as profound, logical truths. Consider a modern corporate executive who is completely consumed by the dog of competitive anger and dominance. He screams at his employees, ruins his physical health, and neglects his children to climb the corporate ladder. He isn't doing this out of a pure love for humanity. He is doing it to feed his fragile pride. But his internal demon doesn't let him see that reality. Instead, the demon constructs a brilliant rationalization. You are doing this for your family. You are sacrificing your personal happiness to provide a legacy for your children. True leadership requires a ruthless, hard-charging edge. The world is a jungle, and you have to be a predator to survive. The man reads this script, sighs with relief, and continues his toxic behavior, completely convinced that he is a noble hero rather than a slave to an angry dog. Think about the modern psychological landscape of addiction. When an individual is hooked on a substance, an online gambling habit, or the constant validation of social media, the pig is completely driving the car. But the pig cannot speak the language of logic. The pig just screams, "Give me more!" So, the demon steps in to translate that scream into a sophisticated intellectual argument. The demon whispers to your mind, "You've had an incredibly stressful week. You deserve a break. This substance actually makes you more creative and relaxed. You can quit whenever you want, but right now, you need to cope with your anxiety. If you don't indulge tonight, you won't be able to function tomorrow." This is what Ghazali calls the ultimate slavery. When your high-level human intelligence is being used purely to design more efficient ways to feed your animal impulses, you are no longer a real human being. You are a genius puppet being controlled by a baseline beast. Your intellect is no longer a tool for liberation. It has become an emotional defense attorney, constantly defending your worst behaviors in the court of your own conscience. You are locked in a hall of mirrors where you are completely incapable of seeing your own corruption because your mind is too smart to get caught. The architecture of sickness, the 7 deadly traps. Ghazali goes much deeper than a simple overview of these 4 internal characters. He breaks down the precise, systematic steps through which these forces launch an attack on your soul, creating a chronic state of psychological rot. He identifies a series of internal spiritual diseases that completely blind your consciousness, matching what modern behavioral science calls the compounding effect of toxic habits. Every single choice you make, no matter how small or insignificant it seems, leaves a permanent psychological footprint on your nervous system. Ghazali uses the metaphor of a pure, highly polished iron mirror to describe the original state of the human soul. When you are born, your internal mirror is perfectly clean, capable of reflecting the true light of wisdom, meaning, and reality. But every time you allow the pig or the dog to run the show, every time you tell a calculated lie to protect your ego, every time you indulge a toxic impulse, every time you lash out in petty spite, it is as if a thick drop of black oil falls onto the surface of that mirror. At first, a single spot of rust or oil doesn't seem like a big deal. You can easily wipe it away with a moment of self-reflection or an apology. But if you continue the behavior day after day, week after week, the black spots begin to spread, blend together, and dry into a hard, impenetrable crust. Eventually, the mirror becomes completely blackened. The light of truth can no longer bounce off it. You enter a state of absolute psychological numbness, what Ghazali calls rain, the total sealing of the heart. When a person reaches this stage of psychological decay, their internal compass is completely broken. They no longer feel guilt after hurting someone. They no longer feel an internal alarm when they lie. They look at their empty, anxious, meaningless life and genuinely believe that the world is to blame. They become completely hyper-reactive, bouncing from one external stimulus to the next, entirely dependent on outside conditions to feel a temporary moment of safety or pleasure. Ghazali identifies the 2 most addictive, lethal forms of this black crust that specifically target high-performing, successful individuals: Riya and Kiba. Riya is the psychological disease of performative validation, the sickness of performing for the social mirror. It is the state of mind where you do things not because they are inherently good, right, or meaningful, but because you are desperate for people to look at you and think you are successful, holy, intelligent, or virtuous. In our modern, hyper-connected culture, Riya has been industrialized. We live in a society that literally rewards people for curated, superficial displays of their lives, their morality, and their accomplishments. We spend massive amounts of psychological energy managing our external image while our actual internal reality is completely falling apart from neglect. Kiba is the dark sin of intellectual and moral arrogance. It is the psychological state where you look at your wealth, your status, or your advanced education, and you look down on ordinary people as if they are separate, inferior, biological material. This is the exact grandiose narcissism that Dostoevsky diagnosed in Raskolnikov. When you are infected with Kiba, you become completely unteachable. You cannot listen to criticism, you cannot tolerate being corrected, and you treat every human interaction as a battle for dominance. Your ego becomes so massive and rigid that it suffocates the sage completely, leaving you entirely alone in a cold tower of your own self-importance. The illusion of corporate self-care. When modern people begin to feel the crushing weight of this internal rot, when the anxiety, the burnout, and the existential dread become too loud to ignore, they look for solutions within the same system that created the problem. We turn to the massive, multi-billion-dollar modern self-help and self-care industry. We download meditation apps that promise to calm our brains in 5 minutes a day. We sign up for luxury wellness retreats, buy crystals, track our sleep cycles with smart rings, and read endless articles about how to optimize our morning routines for maximum productivity. Ghazali looks at this frantic, superficial hustle and smiles with deep, sorrowful pity. He warns us that trying to fix a sick soul with these surface-level behavioral modifications is like trying to cure a deadly internal tumor by applying a beautiful, expensive band-aid to the skin over it. It looks nice, it makes you feel like you are doing something, but the underlying destruction continues entirely uninterrupted. The corporate self-care industry is actually designed by the demon to keep you comfortable in your slavery. It doesn't challenge the rule of the pig or the dog. It just tries to make the animals a little quieter so you can go back to work on Monday morning. It treats your anxiety as a minor operational glitch to be managed, rather than a profound, revolutionary message from your soul, telling you that your entire lifestyle is built on a massive lie. True psychological healing, according to Ghazali, does not come from soothing your ego with soft words, positive affirmations, or luxury pampering. It comes from launching a violent, systematic, highly calculated counterattack against your own internal animals. It requires you to consciously step into the role of the animal tamer. If you want to tame a wild, dangerous lion, you do not sit down with it and read it positive affirmations. You do not give it whatever it wants, whenever it screams. If you do that, the lion will eventually eat you alive. To tame a wild beast, you must understand its mechanics, you must withhold its food, you must establish absolute authority, and you must force it to submit to your will through consistent, unyielding discipline. This is what Ghazali calls mujahadat al-nafs, the ultimate inner jihad, the relentless psychological warfare against the tyranny of your own ego. You must stop treating your desires as commands. You must realize that just because your brain manufactures a sudden, intense craving for a certain substance, a certain validation, or a certain aggressive reaction, you are under absolutely zero obligation to fulfill it. You are the conscious observer standing outside the zoo, not the animal locked inside the cage. The strategy of the animal tamer: starving the beasts. How do you practically execute this warfare in the trenches of your daily life without falling into the trap of self-loathing or toxic repression? Ghazali provides a brilliant behavioral strategy that perfectly predates the most advanced principles of modern cognitive behavioral therapy and habit reversal training. He states that you cannot simply wish an animal drive away through pure willpower. You must use the law of psychological opposition. Every time an animal drive surges through your consciousness, it is trying to force your body to take a specific, physical action. The pig wants you to reach for that phone, open that app, or eat that junk food. The dog wants you to open your mouth and scream an insult at the person who hurt your pride. The demon wants you to write a brilliant text message rationalizing why you are completely justified in your toxic reaction. To break the power of these drives, you must consciously force your body to execute the exact opposite physical action of whatever the animal is demanding. When you feel a massive wave of pride and arrogance surging through your veins when the dog wants you to puff out your chest, dominate the conversation, and brag about your achievements, you must immediately force yourself to go quiet. You must actively look for a way to serve someone else in secret. Find someone who can do absolutely nothing for your status, someone the world considers an underdog, and perform a silent, humble act of kindness for them without telling a single soul. By doing this, you are starving the dog of its validation, cutting off its psychological oxygen supply, and forcing your ego to swallow its own pride. When the pig is screaming for immediate comfort, laziness, and indulgence when your brain is begging you to stay in bed, skip the hard work, and escape into digital distraction, you must immediately push the blanket off your body, stand up, and dive headfirst into the most difficult, uncomfortable task on your to-do list. You don't wait for the feeling of inspiration to strike you. Inspiration is a luxury that slaves to the pig wait for. The animal tamer acts regardless of how they feel, knowing that the action must shape the emotion, not the other way around. This process of intentional opposition creates a massive psychological shock to your system. It forces your brain to build entirely new neural pathways, completely breaking the automatic, hyperreactive loops that have kept you trapped for years. Every time you say no to an animal craving, the beast gets a little weaker, a little smaller, and a little quieter. And every time you force the body to act out the wisdom of the sage gets a little stronger, a little more conscious, and a little more authoritative. You are systematically shifting the locus of power in your internal world, from the basement back to the throne. The dark art of self-observation, becoming the silent witness. The foundational skill required to master this alchemy of the soul is what Ghazali calls muraqabah, a concept that goes infinitely deeper than the commercialized, watered-down mindfulness that is popular in modern culture today. Muraqabah is the hyper-vigilant, constant state of psychological self-surveillance. It is the ability to stand outside your own mind and watch your thoughts, your cravings, and your emotional impulses rise and fall in real time without identifying with them. Most people live their lives in a state of complete psychological enmeshment. They believe that they are their thoughts. When a voice inside their head says, "I am a total failure," they don't say, "Oh, look, a negative thought just popped up." They actually believe they are a failure. When an emotional wave of hot anger washes through their body, they become the anger. They lose all consciousness, merge completely with the emotion, and act it out through their voice and their fists. They are entirely reactive, living like a leaf being blown around in a chaotic windstorm. Through the practice of deep self-observation, you build a massive, protective, psychological buffer zone between the stimulus and your response. You stop being the actor caught in the middle of the violent drama, and you become the silent, detached director, sitting in the audience, watching the play unfold. When a toxic craving or an aggressive impulse hits your consciousness, instead of panicking or giving in, you simply sit still, breathe, and analyze it with the cold, objective curiosity of a forensic scientist. You say to yourself, "Ah, look at that. The pig is throwing a massive tantrum right now because I'm withholding its dopamine. My heart rate is increasing, my chest feels tight, and my brain is manufacturing incredibly creative excuses to make me pick up that phone. It's a fascinating performance. Let's sit here and watch how long this wave lasts before it breaks." The moment you objectify your emotions in this manner, their power over you completely vanishes. An emotion can only control you if you allow yourself to blend into it. When you isolate it, shine the bright light of consciousness on it, and refuse to feed it with your physical movement, the wave will eventually peak, lose its energy, and dissolve back into the subconscious void from which it came. You have successfully navigated the inner attack without firing a single shot. You have proven to the animals in your zoo that you are the one holding the keys to the cages. Reclaiming the kingdom, the true meaning of freedom. Ghazali concludes his profound psychological anatomy by redefining the entire concept of human freedom, a definition that shatters the foundational illusions of modern consumer culture. In contemporary society, we are taught that freedom means the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. It means having unlimited options to fulfill your desires, maximize your pleasures, and indulge your impulses without any external restraint. We look at a billionaire who can fly to any island, buy any luxury item, and indulge any physical craving at a moment's notice, and we say, that is the most free person on earth. But Ghazali pulls back the curtain on this glamorous lie and shows us that this person is actually the ultimate slave. They are not a master. They are a helpless servant to a ravenous pig and a spoiled dog. If you cannot say no to your cravings, if you cannot control your tongue when you are angry, if you cannot pull your eyes away from a screen when you need to focus, and if you cannot quiet your mind when you want to sleep, then you have zero freedom. You are a biological machine being driven around by primal evolutionary programming and corporate algorithms designed to exploit your weaknesses. True psychological freedom is not the ability to fulfill your desires. True freedom is the absolute internal power to master your desires. It is the state of mind where your sage has been fully restored to its rightful throne, wielding an intellect that is perfectly aligned with objective truth and moral beauty. It is the ability to look at a highly tempting, addictive, or lucrative opportunity that violates your integrity, look it right in the eye, and say, "No, thank you," without a single ounce of internal struggle or regret. When you achieve this state of internal alchemy, your life transforms from an anxious, chaotic battleground into a deep, untouchable sanctuary of peace. You stop chasing the cheap, passing phantoms of external success, wealth, and applause, because you have discovered the infinite, self-sustaining treasure of a clean internal mirror. You move through this broken world with absolute authority, absolute humility, and absolute clarity. You are no longer a victim of the inner attack. You have successfully tamed the zoo, liberated your consciousness from the cage of the ego, and completely reprogrammed your soul to reflect the eternal light of reality. We are a generation obsessed with control. We track our data, plan our investments, optimize our career paths, and live by a strict script of cause and effect. We firmly believe that if we execute a specific sequence of actions, the universe is obligated to give us a specific result. If we go to the right school, work the right hours, eat the right foods, and pull the right economic levers, we should be able to guarantee a predictable, successful life. We treat reality like a giant, mechanical clock, and we treat ourselves as the master engineers who can tweak the gears to achieve absolute certainty. But 900 years ago, Ghazali wrote a book that sent a massive shockwave through the history of philosophy, completely shattering this illusion of control. In his legendary text, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he launched a brilliant psychological and metaphysical assault on the foundational belief that nature operates on independent, rigid, unyielding laws of cause and effect. At the time, the intellectual world was completely dominated by the ideas of Aristotle, which had been adapted by brilliant Islamic scholars like Avicenna and Al-Farabi. These philosophers argued that the material world runs on an unbreakable chain of natural causality. They believed that certain objects possess inherent, independent powers that automatically produce specific outcomes. For example, fire has an inherent power to burn. When fire touches cotton, the cotton must burn as a matter of absolute natural necessity. The fire is the cause, and the burning is the effect, and nothing in the universe can break that link. Al-Ghazali looked at this scientific certainty and recognized a profound, dangerous psychological trap. He realized that when you believe nature runs on independent, mechanical laws, your mind automatically falls into a state of deep existential blindness. You stop looking at the deeper meaning of reality. You begin to treat the material world as a closed, dead system of cold machinery. More importantly, this belief system turns you into an anxious control freak. It convinces your ego that if you can just master the formulas of cause and effect, you can become the god of your own life. You become completely dependent on external conditions for your peace of mind, assuming that your happiness is directly tied to your ability to manipulate the material world around you. Al-Ghazali stepped onto the philosophical battlefield and declared that this unbreakable chain of cause and effect is nothing more than a giant psychological illusion. He argued that there is absolutely no logical necessity linking a cause to an effect. What we call a natural law is not an objective reality out there in the world. It is merely a habit of the human mind. We do not see the cause actually creating the effect. We only see one event happening, and then we see another event happening right after it. We are mistaking our own mental patterns for the absolute structure of the universe, dismantling the illusion of cause and effect. To make this mind-bending concept simple and accessible, Al-Ghazali used a famous, everyday example, a piece of white cotton being touched by a roaring flame. The traditional philosophers looked at this scene and said, "The fire is creating the burning. The cause is inside the fire." But Al-Ghazali stepped in and asked a deeply disruptive question. How do you actually know that? What is your actual, empirical proof? If you look closely at the event with your eyes, you see the fire, you see the cotton, and then you see the cotton turn black and turn to ash. You see the coexistence of the two events. But you cannot actually observe a physical thing called a cause passing from the fire into the cotton. You cannot see an independent law of necessity with a microscope. All you are truly observing is sequence. Event A happens, and then event B happens. Because you have seen event A followed by event B 10,000 times since the day you were born, your brain builds a powerful, automatic psychological expectation. Your mind creates a shortcut, glues the two events together, and names that glue causality. But Al-Ghazali argues that this is a massive logical error. Just because two things always happen together does not mean that one has the independent power to create the other. To illustrate this, think about a modern example. Imagine an alien who comes to Earth and watches a human press a button on a remote control, and a television screen across the room instantly turns on. The alien watches this happen 1,000 times in a row. If the alien operates on the standard philosophy of cause and effect, it will conclude that the plastic button itself possesses an inherent, magical power to emit light and sound on the screen. The button is the cause. The television turning on is the effect. But you, as a modern human, know that the alien is completely wrong. The button has no independent power to turn the TV on. The entire event is only possible because there is a massive, invisible infrastructure of electricity, wireless signals, engineering designs, and a power grid working behind the scenes to dynamically connect those two events every single second. If the power plant shuts down, the button becomes completely useless. Al-Ghazali argues that the entire material universe is exactly like that television screen. The fire does not burn the cotton because it has its own power. The fire burns the cotton because reality is being dynamically sustained, calculated, and connected in that exact manner by a higher intelligence, millisecond by millisecond. If that higher intelligence decided to change the signal, the fire would touch the cotton, and the cotton would feel cold, or turn into gold, or start singing a song. There are no independent, dead laws of nature running on autopilot. There is only a continuous, dynamic flow of creation. The universe is not a mechanical clock that was wound up in the past and left to run on its own. It is a cinematic film being projected frame by frame, and the only reason the current frame looks like the previous frame is because the director chooses to maintain consistency. The breakdown of the control freak archetype. When you fully absorb this philosophical shift, when you realize that the material world possesses zero independent causality, it triggers a massive revolutionary collapse of your internal psychology. It completely demolishes what modern mental health professionals call the control freak archetype. Most of our daily anxiety is fueled by the toxic belief that we are the ultimate authors of our outcomes. We tell ourselves, if I execute my strategy perfectly, I must succeed. If I fail, it means I didn't work hard enough, or I made a bad move, or I didn't account for a variable. This mindset creates a crushing, unbearable amount of psychological pressure. It locks your nervous system into a permanent state of hypervigilance, forcing you to constantly scan your environment, anticipate threats, and try to manage every single person and circumstance around you to ensure your desired result. But Al-Ghazali's philosophy reminds you of a liberating, humbling truth. You do not control the gears of reality. You never have, and you never will. You can plant the seed perfectly, water it on time, and use the best fertilizer in the world, but you do not possess the independent power to make the plant grow. The growth of the seed requires an infinite web of cosmic variables, ecological balances, and micro-consequences that are completely outside your line of sight. When you fail to realize this, your life becomes a violent emotional roller coaster. When things go well, your ego swells up with toxic pride and arrogance, Kibra, convincing you that you are a genius who mastered cause and effect. But the moment the market crashes, or a global event disrupts your industry, or a sudden illness hits your body, you plunge into a deep abyss of depression, anxiety, and self-loathing. You feel uniquely broken because your strategy failed. Al-Ghazali cuts the wires of this emotional rollercoaster. He forces you to shift your locus of control from the external world to your internal state. By showing you that material cause and effect is an illusion, he relieves you of the impossible burden of trying to run the universe. You realize that you are only responsible for the inputs, your intentions, your efforts, your integrity, and your moral choices. The outputs, the wealth, the status, the health, and the external results belong entirely to the higher architecture of reality. This realization transitions you from an anxious, controlling state of mind to a state of profound psychological surrender, what Al-Ghazali's tradition calls tawakkul, radical, active trust. Tawakkul is not laziness. It is not sitting on the couch and waiting for things to happen. It is the highest form of spiritual and emotional maturity. You work with absolute focus. You prepare with absolute diligence. You execute with absolute excellence. And then you completely detach yourself from the outcome. You drop the desperate need to control the screen, and you find your peace entirely in the purity of your presence. The psychology of material addiction. To understand why our culture is so deeply resistant to Al-Ghazali's view of reality, we have to analyze the specific psychological addiction that material cause and effect feeds. The ego loves predictability because predictability gives it a false sense of godhood. If the world is just a dead machine of cause and effect, then I can buy my way into safety. I can accumulate enough money to protect myself from suffering. I can accumulate enough status to protect myself from rejection. I can use the tools of science and technology to build a perfect, impenetrable shield around my life. This mindset turns us into material addicts. We begin to look at external objects as if they possess the independent power to grant us internal emotional states. We look at a luxury car and think, that object has the power to give me worth. We look at a corporate promotion and think, that title has the power to give me security. We look at a romantic partner and think, that person has the power to give me wholeness. This is the psychological equivalent of looking at the fire and believing it has the independent power to burn. You are projecting an internal higher reality onto a dead piece of material matter. Al-Ghazali's critique of causality acts like a cold bucket of water thrown in the face of this consumerist delusion. He proves to you that no material object has the independent capacity to generate a single psychological state within your soul. Money cannot create security. It can only buy comfort. Status cannot create worth. It can only buy attention. A partner cannot create wholeness. They can only share their own fragmentation with you. The emotional state of peace, fulfillment, and security is an entirely internal quality that is dynamically generated within your consciousness, completely separate from the objects you possess. Think about how many billionaires live in a state of permanent paranoia, checking their security systems, worrying about their assets, and popping sleeping pills just to quiet their anxious minds. If wealth possessed the independent causal power to create security, then every single wealthy person would automatically be completely peaceful. But it doesn't. Think about how many people have achieved their absolute dream career, stood at the top of their professional mountain, and felt an unexplainable, crushing wave of emptiness settle over their hearts. They followed the script of cause and effect perfectly, yet the promised result of happiness never arrived. Al-Ghazali warns us that as long as you look to the material world as the source of your internal emotional states, you will remain a permanent beggar. You will spend your life frantically chasing objects, pulling levers, and running on a hedonic treadmill that never stops, completely blind to the fact that the fountain you are trying to drink from is located entirely inside your own chest. Breaking free from the prison of human habits. One of the most brilliant aspects of Al-Ghazali's analysis in The Incoherence of the Philosophers is his deep understanding of how human habits of thought construct our perception of reality. He notes that the only reason we believe cause and effect is absolute is because of the relentless repetition of our experiences. Our brains are hardwired to mistake familiarity for truth. When you see a certain sequence of events happen over and over again, your mind falls into a state of psychological sleep. You stop questioning the world. You begin to take everything for granted. You look at the sun rising in the east every morning, the air filling your lungs, the water quenching your thirst, and the earth staying solid beneath your feet. And you think, of course it works this way. It has to work this way. It's just natural law. This psychological familiarity strips the world of its wonder, its mystery, and its sacredness. It turns you into a functional zombie who moves through an incredibly miraculous universe without ever feeling a single spark of awe or gratitude. You treat your existence as a boring, mechanical routine. Al-Ghazali's philosophy cracks this zombie mindset wide open. He forces you to realize that every single moment of your life is an absolute, unrepeatable miracle. The fact that your heart beats 70 times a minute without you ever needing to consciously think about it is not a dead biological mechanism. It is an active, dynamic gift being sustained second by second. The fact that the air you breathe perfectly matches the cellular needs of your lungs is not a random coincidence of evolutionary cause and effect. It is a calculated, beautiful reality being woven in real time. When you break free from the prison of familiarity, your relationship with everyday life completely changes. You stop taking your health, your sanity, your relationships, and your existence for granted. You realize that because there is no independent necessity to cause and effect, everything you have could be completely rewritten in the blink of an eye. The ground beneath your feet doesn't have to stay solid. Your mind doesn't have to stay sane. Your lungs don't have to find air. This realization instills a deep, beautiful sense of radical humility within your psychology. You move from a state of arrogant entitlement where you assume the universe owes you a predictable life because you followed the rules to a state of profound, constant gratitude. You look at every single normal, quiet, peaceful day not as a boring routine, but as a masterpiece of cosmic design that has been custom built for you to experience. You stop trying to dominate and predict the world, and you begin to stand before it in a state of absolute, breathless wonder. The illusion of scientific dogmatism. In our contemporary modern culture, we have replaced the religious dogmatism of the past with a new, highly sophisticated form of scientific dogmatism. We look at scientists, tech billionaires, and data analysts as the high priests of our era. We believe that if a concept cannot be measured in a lab, calculated with an algorithm, or proven with a peer-reviewed cause and effect study, then it simply doesn't exist, or it isn't worth our time. We treat the current boundaries of scientific knowledge as the absolute, definitive map of all reality. Al-Ghazali was not an anti-scientific fanatic. He explicitly stated in his writings that anyone who denies the mathematical and empirical truths of science is doing a massive disservice to humanity. He completely accepted the formulas of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics, but he launched a sharp, prophetic warning against the psychological arrogance of scientific dogmatism, an arrogance that treats the description of a process as the explanation of a process. Science is incredibly skilled at description. It can look at a seed growing into a tree and describe the exact chemical reactions, cellular divisions, and genetic codes that are taking place. It can give beautiful, highly complex names to every single step of the journey. But Al-Ghazali points out that naming a process is not the same thing as explaining why it has the power to happen in the first place. Giving a Latin name to a cellular mechanism does not change the fact that the mechanism itself is a profound, unfathomable mystery. Science can map out the sequence of event A and event B with flawless precision, but it can never tell you what the underlying energy is that forces those two events to dance together. When we fall into scientific dogmatism, we fall into the exact same trap as the ancient Aristotelian philosophers. We mistake the habit of our observation for the absolute limits of possibility. We become arrogant intellectuals who believe that because we have mapped out a few gears of the clock, we have mastered the mind of the clockmaker. We dismiss the spiritual, the existential, and the mystical dimensions of human life as unscientific nonsense, simply because our small logical tools are completely incapable of measuring them. Al-Ghazali challenges us to adopt a state of epistemic humility, the psychological willingness to admit that our cognitive reason is not the highest peak of the universe. Reason is a beautiful, necessary tool for organizing our survival on Earth, but it is completely blind to the infinite ocean of reality that lies beyond the material horizon. True intelligence begins when you use your reason to discover the exact boundaries of your reason, and you have the immense humility to bow your head before the profound mystery that lies on the other side. The freedom of the disillusioned soul. What is the ultimate psychological destination of Al-Ghazali's assault on material reality? Where does he leave your soul once he has torn down your belief in cause and effect, smashed your control freak archetype, and exposed the emptiness of your material addictions? He leaves you standing in a space of absolute, untouchable internal freedom. He delivers you from the ultimate psychological error, the error of material displacement. As long as you believe that the material world possesses independent causality, you are a hostage to your environment. If the economy drops, your peace drops. If a person insults you, your worth drops. If your physical youth fades, your meaning fades. You are a helpless fragment of dust being tossed around by the brutal, unpredictable winds of material cause and effect. Your soul is a victim of permanent whiplash, constantly reacting to the external changes of a world you cannot control. But when you achieve complete disillusionment, when you look through the matrix of the material world and realize that it has zero independent power over your consciousness, the winds completely die down. You look at the stock market, you look at your professional status, you look at your reputation, and you look at your physical body, and you realize that these things are just passing costumes in a grand cosmic play. They do not hold the keys to your worth. They do not hold the keys to your security. They do not hold the keys to your destiny. You stop looking at your life through the anxious microscopic lens of cause and effect, and you begin to look at it through the lens of absolute meaning. You realize that every single circumstance that enters your life, whether it looks like a material victory or a material tragedy, is not a random, mechanical accident. It is a highly deliberate, custom-built psychological mirror designed specifically to wake up your sage, test your integrity, and refine your soul. If you lose your wealth, it is not a glitch in the machine of cause and effect. It is a profound lesson designed to teach you that your security was never supposed to be anchored in paper money. If you experience a sudden heartbreak, it is not a random trauma. It is a powerful invitation to pull your heart away from the illusion of human possession and anchor it in an untouchable eternal love. You stop fighting the external screen of reality. You stop screaming at the projector. You completely drop the exhausting, impossible script of the control freak, and you step into the role of the humble, awake traveler. You walk through this material landscape with light feet and a heavy heart, a heart that is completely anchored in the deep, quiet sanctuary of the present moment. You have successfully broken through the matrix of material causality, dismantled the illusions of the philosophers, and liberated your consciousness to experience the beautiful, unpredictable, miraculous reality of your true soul. We spend our entire lives running from a ghost. We buy products we don't need, accumulate titles that don't satisfy us, and modify our behavior on a daily basis to appease an invisible audience. We look at our reflection in the eyes of society and mistake that shifting, shallow image for our actual identity. Modern psychology calls this the social self, the curated persona, or the ego. We treat this ego like a precious child that must be protected at all costs, completely blind to the fact that it is actually a tyrant holding our genuine humanity hostage. 9 centuries ago, after dismantling his intellect, surviving a physical paralysis, and exposing the matrix of material reality, Al-Ghazali arrived at the final, revolutionary destination of his psychological journey, the Sufi path. When Al-Ghazali left Baghdad as a penniless wanderer, he did not just change his clothes. He initiated a deliberate, systematic ego death. He realized that all his previous suffering, his crippling anxiety, his vocal paralysis, his existential dread was not caused by his environment or his intellectual doubts. It was caused by the basic structure of his egoism. He was infected with a terminal case of nafs, the false, demanding, self-obsessed identity that screams for attention, security, and power every single second of the day. The Sufi path, as Al-Ghazali outlines it in his final psychological masterpiece, Deliverance from Error, is not a collection of abstract mystical theories or cosmic daydreams. It is a ruthless, practical methodology for emotional regeneration and spiritual purification, a process known as Tazkiyah al-Nafs. It is a clinical psychological protocol designed to permanently smash the social mirror, starve the false self to death, and liberate the true consciousness, the sage, to live in a state of absolute, untouchable internal peace. Al-Ghazali warns us that most people live and die without ever experiencing a single moment of true freedom. They believe they are free because they can choose which product to buy or which ideology to follow. But in reality, they are operating within a deep psychological coma. They are entirely reactive creatures, completely dependent on the applause, validation, and feedback of a broken world to feel valid. The Sufi path is the emergency exit out of this coma. It is the realization that to find your true soul, you must have the immense, terrifying courage to let your public identity completely die. The protocol of complete self-abolition. To understand how Al-Ghazali executed this psychological resurrection, we have to look at the practical trenches of his 10-year exile. He did not sit in a beautiful, comfortable ashram drinking tea and thinking positive thoughts. He engaged in a process of intentional, systematic self-abasement, designed to completely shatter his pride, kib, and his performative hypocrisy, riya. In Damascus, the man who was once the most celebrated intellectual in the world, the personal advisor to kings, locked himself inside the quiet tower of the Grand Mosque. He spent his days sweeping the marble floors, cleaning the public restrooms, and washing the feet of poor pilgrims, who had absolutely no idea who he was. If a traveler from Baghdad walked into that mosque and looked at the man holding the broom, they would have seen a dusty, emaciated beggar. They would have thought Al-Ghazali had gone completely insane, losing everything that made his life valuable. But Al-Ghazali was operating with absolute, surgical, psychological precision. He knew that his pride was a living, breathing monster inside his nervous system. It was addicted to being recognized, addicted to being the smartest person in the room, and addicted to looking important. Every time he picked up the broom and cleaned up after a stranger, he was manually slamming a sledgehammer into that monster's face. He was forcing his ego to swallow its own poison until it had no more strength left to scream. This is what modern transpersonal psychology calls the integration of the higher self through the dismantling of the persona. In our contemporary culture, we do the exact opposite. We feed our pride on a daily basis. We post our accomplishments, filter our flaws, and use the language of therapy to justify our selfishness. We are constantly building a more magnificent tower for our ego, completely blind to the fact that the higher the tower grows, the more terrifying our fear of falling becomes. Al-Ghazali proves to us that true psychological liberation does not come from building self-esteem. It comes from achieving complete self-abolition. When you voluntarily lay down your pride, when you walk down to the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy and realize that you are still alive, still breathing, and still whole, a massive cosmic weight falls off your chest. You realize that the opinions of the world possess zero objective reality. They cannot add a single drop of worth to your soul, and they cannot take a single drop away. You stop performing, you drop the exhausting mask, and you step into an untouchable sanctuary of peace, dissecting the two deadliest tumors of the ego. During his deep analytical self-observation, Al-Ghazali isolated the two most destructive, seductive psychological diseases that completely paralyze the human soul, Riya and Ujb. These are the hidden emotional viruses that sabotage even the most well-intentioned, successful individuals. Riya is spiritual and psychological hypocrisy. It is the drive to perform your virtues, your intelligence, your wealth, or your kindness for the public gaze. Al-Ghazali notes that Riya is incredibly subtle. It doesn't just manifest as crude bragging. It can hide behind a mask of deep humility. For example, a modern influencer might post a long, emotional video talking about their vulnerabilities, their mental health struggles, and their deep desire to help the world. They use all the right words of authenticity and alignment. But Al-Ghazali asks you to look at the underlying psychological motive. Why did you press record? Why did you share that private moment with millions of strangers? Were you doing it purely out of love for truth? Or were you doing it to collect the secondary gain of looking authentic, looking deep, and looking evolved in the eyes of your audience? When you suffer from Riya, your virtues are turned into commodities. You are using the most sacred, beautiful dimensions of your humanity to buy cheap attention from a digital screen. Ujbi is the deep, dark sin of self-complacency and moral vanity. It is the psychological state where you look at your clean routine, your advanced education, your successful career, or your high ethical standards, and you become deeply impressed with yourself. You look at the chaotic, struggling people around you and think, "Thank God I am not like them. I work harder, I think deeper, and I make better choices." Al-Ghazali warns that ujb is the ultimate trap for the intelligent person, because it completely cuts you off from genuine empathy and reality. The moment you become impressed with your own goodness, you stop growing. You build a thick wall of moral superiority around your ego, turning your virtues into an absolute weapon of exclusion. You forget that your intelligence, your health, and your opportunities are not permanent achievements you manufactured. They are temporary, dynamic gifts that could be taken away from you in a single second. Ujbi turns your soul into a cold, dead monument to your own ego, entirely incapable of learning, loving, or connecting with the messy reality of human nature. The alchemy of spiritual taste, from knowledge to being. The fundamental turning point of Al-Ghazali's deliverance from error occurred when he realized the absolute, unbridgeable difference between what he called ilm intellectual knowledge, and dork, direct spiritual taste. Before his collapse, Al-Ghazali was a master of ilm. He had read every text, memorized every argument, and could define every theological concept with scientific precision. If you asked him to explain the concept of detachment, he could lecture for 4 hours about its historical roots, its psychological mechanics, and its moral definitions. But he didn't actually taste detachment. He was still deeply attached to his pension, his status, and his career. He was like a medical doctor who has memorized every line of a textbook on nutrition but is physically starving to death in reality. The Sufi path transitions you from the cold data of the mind to the warm, living reality of your actual being. It is the realization that you cannot think your way into a healthy soul. You have to live your way into it. Think about a modern parallel. You can spend thousands of hours reading self-help books, listening to psychological podcasts, and memorizing the vocabulary of therapy. You can talk for hours about your inner child, your trauma responses, your boundaries, and your mindfulness frameworks. You have all the intellectual definitions down to a science, but when someone cuts you off in traffic, or your partner says something that hurts your pride, all that information completely evaporates. You instantly transform into an angry, reactive animal. Your ilm means absolutely nothing in the trenches of reality, because it is just a coat of paint sitting on the surface of your ego. It has not penetrated your nervous system. It has not changed your actual taste of life. Al-Ghazali challenges us to drop our obsession with collecting intellectual concepts. Stop reading about peace and start practicing the raw, uncomfortable silence of the present moment. Stop analyzing your lack of connection and start executing the painful, beautiful acts of radical vulnerability and self-sacrifice. You must move from the constant, exhausting noise of talking about the truth to the quiet, undeniable power of actually embodying it. True transformation is not a change of opinion. It is a profound, structural change in the quality of your actual presence. The protocol of Tazkiyah, the practical daily combat. How do we practically enter this path of purification in the middle of our chaotic, modern, hyper-stimulated lives? Al-Ghazali does not demand that we all move to mosque towers or sweep floors in secret for 10 years. Instead, he provides a beautiful, highly actionable set of micro-habits for daily psychological combat, built on 3 core pillars: musharata, pre-commitment; murasabah, real-time monitoring; and mu'aqabah, self-correction. The protocol begins the exact second you open your eyes in the morning, a phase called musharata. Before you check your phone, before you look at your notifications, and before your ego has the chance to boot up its daily script of worries and ambitions, you sit still on the edge of your bed and establish a strict contract with your mind. You look at your consciousness and say, I have been granted another 24 hours of existence. This day is an absolute, unrepeatable miracle. My mind is going to try to drag me into anxiety, anger, pride, and distraction. I am making a firm, non-negotiable commitment right now that I will not let the animals run the house today. I will monitor my tongue, filter my inputs, and anchor my heart in the truth. The second phase is murasabah, the practice of continuous, real-time psychological surveillance throughout your day. You become the silent witness standing outside your own consciousness. When you are sitting in a business meeting and an opportunity arises to make a petty, sarcastic comment that will make you look smart while making a colleague look foolish, you don't just open your mouth and let the words fly. You catch the impulse in mid-air. You watch the dog of your pride snarling inside your chest, desperate for that cheap hit of superiority, and you choose to stay completely silent, letting the impulse starve to death. The final phase is mu'aqabah, the evening audit. Before you go to sleep, you sit down and conduct a cold, objective, forensic review of your choices. You do not treat yourself with toxic self-flagellation or blind self-justification. You look at your day as an independent manager looking at a data sheet. If you find that you lied to protect your image, or lost your temper, or wasted hours chasing dopamine on a screen, you must instantly issue a direct, physical correction to your psyche. If you acted out of arrogance, you must force yourself to text that person and apologize with radical humility. If you acted out of laziness, you must force yourself to wake up an hour earlier the next morning to do the hard work. You must teach your ego that every single lapse in integrity carries an immediate, uncomfortable consequence. By doing this, You are retraining your nervous system, showing your lower drives that you are an absolute master who cannot be manipulated by cheap emotional tantrums. The ultimate release from the prison of anxiety. When you systematically execute this purification protocol over a sustained period of time, something truly miraculous happens to your internal geography. You experience the absolute dissolution of chronic anxiety. Most modern anxiety is caused by the relentless, exhausting project of identity maintenance. We are terrified of failure, terrified of aging, terrified of losing our money, and terrified of what people think of us, because we have anchored our entire sense of existence in temporary, external objects. We have made ourselves hostages to variables we cannot control. We are constantly playing defense, terrified that the world is going to look through our achievements and discover that we are actually empty, fragile, and scared underneath. Al-Ghazali's Sufi path delivers you from this prison by showing you that the thing you are trying so hard to protect your ego does not actually exist. It is a phantom, a construct of your memories, your conditioning, and your social feedback loops. It is a ghost that has zero objective reality. When you stop feeding this ghost with your daily worry, your daily performative validation, and your daily pride, the phantom begins to fade away. And when the ego dies, your anxiety dies along with it. You can no longer be insulted because there is no rigid pride left inside you to be offended. You can no longer be intimidated because you have already embraced the absolute bottom of human status. You can no longer be paralyzed by the fear of loss because you have already given away your attachment to possession. You transition from a state of anxious scarcity to a state of absolute, overflowing internal sovereignty. You no longer walk through the world like a beggar holding out a cup, pleading with your career, your partner, or your audience to give you a sense of worth and identity. You walk through the world like a king who carries an infinite, self-sustaining treasure inside his own chest. You are completely free to love without needing to possess, free to work without needing to perform, and free to exist without needing to justify your existence to a single soul. Reprogramming the soul, the living return. The ultimate beauty of Al-Ghazali's philosophy is that it does not end in isolation. After spending 10 years wandering as an anonymous mystic, completely breaking his ego and finding absolute internal stillness, Al-Ghazali did not stay hidden in the mosque towers of Damascus. He did not spend the rest of his life sitting in a cave enjoying his own enlightenment. He packed his bags, walked back the gates of Baghdad, and returned to the university lecture halls. But he returned as a completely different human being. He was no longer the arrogant professor chasing prestige, wealth, and academic dominance. He was a humble servant of truth. He used his brilliant intellect, his advanced legal knowledge, and his flawless grasp of philosophy, not to build his own kingdom, but to heal the broken, anxious minds of his students and his society. His voice had returned, but it was no longer the voice of his ego. It was the pure, unhindered instrument of his soul. This is the ultimate mapping of human psychological maturity. You start in the ordinary world, chasing the illusions of success, wealth, and status. You experience the inevitable, painful collapse of that shallow existence, the anxiety, the burnout, the physical sickness of the mind. You leave the world behind, step down into the dark basement of your overthinking, dismantle your logic, and launch a violent, disciplined counterattack against your own ego. But your final destination is to return straight back to the ordinary world, step into your daily routine, and run your business, manage your family, and serve your community with a clean internal mirror. Do not allow your mind to remain a chaotic, loud zoo where the animals run wild and your soul suffocates in the basement. Take the steering wheel back from the demon of your rationalizations. Have the immense, revolutionary courage to look past the social mirror, stop performing for a broken audience, and accept the absolute responsibility of your internal freedom. Tame your appetite, conquer your anger, discipline your intellect, and anchor your consciousness in the deep, quiet, untouchable reality of the present moment. Step out of the dark prison of your false self. Embrace the beautiful, messy, profound mystery of your true nature, and allow the timeless philosophy of Al-Ghazali to permanently reprogram your soul.